U.S. Navy warships designed to take battle damage, return fire, and stay in the fight. They can absorb incredible amounts of stress. Every system on board is held together in one way or another by the simple and ubiquitous nuts and bolts. The proper use of threaded fasteners is important in nearly any application, and in some, can make the difference between life and death. Hi, I'm Chris, and today we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of nuts and bolts. In October of 1990, a major steam leak occurred on board the amphibious assault ship USS Iwo Jima. 10 sailors lost their lives. The investigation determined the cause was the failure of the bonnet nuts of a large steam valve. That valve had just been repaired, where the bonnet nuts and studs were replaced. But instead of using studs and nuts made of heat-treated steel, the replacement studs were a mixture of studs and bolts, and instead of steel nuts, the replacement nuts were black oxide-coated brass. Subject to the high pressures and temperatures of the steam system, the nuts failed catastrophically, allowing the valve bonnet assembly to separate from the body, releasing steam into the boiler room. The sailors never had a chance. Obviously, that's a catastrophic example, and while it might seem extreme in the context of your classic car, using the wrong fasteners or tightening them improperly in your engine or braking systems could be tragic as well. As viewers of my other videos know, I'm restoring a 1966 Triumph Spitfire. As they may also know, I served over 24 years in the United States Navy. The information that I'm about to share with you is from Naval Ship's Tech Manual, or NSTM 75. Which is the Navy's general guidance on the use of threaded fasteners. I figured if it was good enough for a warship, it was good enough for my Triumph. So if you ask a lot of people how big a bolt is, they may say it's a 1/2 inch or a 9/16, but that's not the bolt size. That's the bolt head size, this guy right here. If you went to your local hardware store and told them you needed a 9/16 inch bolt, you immediately recognize that something wasn't right, because you'd get something like this. So what's the deal? To understand how to properly classify a bolt, we need to know the different parts of one. Believe it or not, something as simple as a bolt has different parts. First, I'll use this nice shiny one here to show you as an example. You got your hex head. This is obviously where you're going to turn the bolt to tighten it or loosen it. Next, you've got the body, this smooth part or the shank. That's the smooth part between the bolt head and the threaded portion. Then there's the bearing surface, which is on the underside of the head. That's the contact point between the bolt and whatever you're putting together. And then finally we have the threaded area. The threaded area has a major diameter, which is the outer diameter of all the threads, and then a root area, which is a slightly smaller diameter, taken up by just the base metal with no threads. So now that we know its parts, how do I classify the bolt to make sure that I can find the right one? Obviously, I need to know the length and the diameter, but what about the threads? How coarse or how fine? And what about the material? Do I know that I'm going to use the right stuff? If the original fastener is still there, that's pretty easy. You're either going to use it or replace it with an identical one. I'll talk about a little later how we know if whether or not we're going to reuse it or not. There's some criteria that you want to inspect to make sure that you're not going to put in a bad fastener. But if the original fastener is not installed or it's missing, which was not uncommon on Dorothy, that's where your workshop manual or your parts manuals are going to come into play. So let's say you look it up at the particular part you're in, and it says that you need a 3/8 28 × 2 UNF. Well, what the heck does that mean? Well, the first number, the 3/8, is the bolt's diameter. That's the major diameter. So not of the head, but of the bolt itself, the shank and the threaded area, the major diameter. That'd be 3/8 of an inch. Remember, don't confuse the head size with the bolt size. The second number, the 28, is the thread pitch, or how many threads per inch the bolt has. The higher the number, the more threads per inch. And the last number, the 2, is the length of the bolt. And that length is from the bottom of the bolt head or the bearing surface to the end of the threaded portion. 2 inches. Does not include the head of the bolt. So what about this UNF? Well, if you look at these 2 bolts, let me get you a nicer one here. If you look at these 2 bolts, you can probably pretty clearly tell that the threads are different. This top one would be referred to as a UNC, or a Unified National Coarse Thread. This other one would be a UNF, or a Unified National Fine Thread. Now the coarse threads are more prevalent, much easier to find. As a matter of fact, I've been to some hardware stores where I can't find the fine threads at all. They take a lot more abuse. They're easier to get in and out a little faster, and they're less prone to cross-threading. The fine threads, however, are a little bit stronger, and they can absorb a much higher stress. That being said, the vast majority of the bolts that I found on Dorothy were UNF. So you may find some additional bolt nomenclature, a 3A or other letters, or LH, RH, and that's essentially for the thread type or the thread style, the quality of the threads, and then whether or not it's right-handed or left-handed. Now I did mention material, and you may see some things on the head of your bolts. If you can see these here, you can see those lines on it, or the hash marks. I'll see if I can find a different one. If you look at this one, you can see that there's 6 on them. This is a grade 8 bolt. This is a grade 5 bolt. They're pretty much both made out of hardened steel. It's just how they're heat treated. I'm not going to get into the materials too much. If you have a doubt or you're not sure what material you use, you need to go find that out on your own. It's kind of beyond the scope of what I'm going to talk about. One other thing that I want to make a point of before I get too deep into this is there is a technical difference between a bolt, a stud, and a cap screw. So studs, pretty much everybody can recognize a stud. Threaded at both ends, the 2 thread pitches may be different, but you don't have a hex head or a bolt head here. So this would be an example of a small stud. A cap screw and a bolt, the difference between those two is a bolt is designed to be attached with a nut. A cap screw like this, where the threads run all the way up to the bearing surface, these are really designed to go into a threaded hole. Many of the bolts that you'll find, especially in the store, the smaller than they get, less than about an inch, you won't see a shoulder on a bolt. Once they start getting larger, you'll see shoulders. So if you are going to be using it as a cap screw and you need a good solid 1.5 or 2 inches, you're going to be having to look for something like this that's threaded all the way to the bearing surface. So now that we know a little bit about a bolt identification and the construction, let's talk about how they can fail.